do that, I want to do two more issues on Raiola. One of those is what you just mentioned there, which is I think that people have had kind of the assumption in the past that Georgia didn't want this. They didn't want the elite quarterback. They didn't want the elite wide receivers. They wanted to kind of do things a different way. And I do believe that Georgia, I think, genuinely thinks, and I think they probably should think, hey, you got to play great defense. You got to have dominant play on both lines of scrimmage. That's incredibly important. I don't believe that changes for Georgia, even with the presence of a guy like Raiola in the program. But I think the fact that they do go so all in on Dylan here, and they are now entertaining the kinds of wide receivers that want to play with a guy like Dylan Raiola, I think that's an indication to would-be Georgia critics that Georgia wants to be just as good and dynamic offensively as it has been defensively, and they want to kind of try to find a way for those two sides of the ball to continue to complement each other. But this notion that Georgia somehow doesn't want the great quarterback or doesn't want the great wide receivers, I think the mood around the program this summer sort of shows you how wrong that is, I believe.
If you'll allow me to put on my conspiracy cap here, I think you'd agree it's undeniable that Georgia's offense in big games, in games against teams that are capable of matching up with the talent-wise, was just a different offense than what we saw against overmatched opponents like Kentucky, Missouri last year, even Georgia Tech, to an example there. And I think that's by design. Whether you agree that's a good strategy or not, Georgia very clearly opens things up against better competition. Dylan Raiola comes into the program at the start of the 2024 season. You know who else is coming into the SEC in the start of the 2024 season? Texas and Oklahoma.
Yep.
They're doing away with divisions. Georgia's schedule is going to get more difficult. That is just the reality of taking Missouri, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Vanderbilt off your annual schedule every year and adding in better games. You're going to need to see Georgia play with that same level of offensive intensity, that same level of offensive openness against better teams, simply because you're going to have a better schedule. And so I think what you saw last year from Stetson Bennett and the way he was able to play for Georgia in those bigger games, where he was able to rise and elevate his game in those circumstances, I think sort of maybe opened the door to Kirby's mind a little bit of, hey, look, going forward, we're going to have to open things up and have a sort of an offensive equivalent to what our defense has been in recent seasons. And I do think that went a long way in sort of assuaging any concerns you might have out there about what Dylan might see going into the future with this Georgia offense and how open it might truly be. So with the schedule getting more difficult, Georgia, I think, again, clearly making an effort to get better and more talented in the wide receiver room. Obviously, the tight end room, so long as Todd Hartley is there, is going to be the best in the country. With all that in mind, with the schedule getting tougher, with the SEC getting tougher, with, again, a longer season of games, with an expanded college football playoff, you're just naturally playing better teams. I think that all factors into why Georgia, in the last two cycles, obviously going after Arch a year ago, and then once again going after and successfully landing Dylan in this cycle, it all sort of makes sense as to why you've maybe seen that change, seen that schematic shift in terms of what Georgia is doing.
I think that's a legitimately great take, and I had not considered that angle of it, that the Georgia schedule is going to get tougher in future years. And it's interesting to think that Georgia, which has dominated college football the last 2 years, knows it needs to be even better moving forward, and this is maybe a step in that direction, Connor. I think that's a really wise assessment of the situation. All right.